Unblock is all about helping leaders. It's a practical guide for leaders. It gives leaders a handbook of what they can do to overcome organizational obstacles. It all starts with having a clear goal in mind or a certain ambition that they need to achieve, which most leaders have. And then we go through 6 possible areas of the organization that can be blocked, starting with strategy. Crafting a strategy that actually creates alignment and focus at scale, steering, everything around setting effective goals and finding the right things to measure, accelerating decision making and quality at every level, ownership, developing a workplace where people happily take ownership and can do what is right for organization, teamwork, so everything around psychological safety and mastering those practices of reflection, improvement, and feedback that we talked about. And finally, meetings, which is about replacing useless meetings with engaging rhythms of meetings that drive the world.
Welcome to Strategic Edge, our subtitle, Applying Transformative Leadership. We are glad you could join us today. We are a podcast for leaders and by leaders. We're going to interview the best and the brightest of leaders to be able to provide you information. We're here to inform, to instruct, and to inspire you on your leadership journey. My name is Ted Davis. My company is Grace Strategic Services, Inc. We're proud to be the sponsor of this podcast. And we encourage you to take the information that we're going to share, make it your own, absorb it, then reflect on it. What does it mean to you? And finally commit to an action plan. So with that, let's get started with today's episode. Well, wonderful day today. My first overseas guest. I think this is the first podcast I've had where my guest is actually over the Atlantic, across the Atlantic. I'm talking today with Jurriaan Kamer. Did I pronounce that right?
Yeah, that was great.
Good. Jurriaan is in the Netherlands. He is a Dutch organizational change expert. He's also an author, a speaker, focuses on helping leaders have an impact by eliminating ineffective strategies, pointless meetings, bureaucratic structure, and slow decision making. So over the past several decades, he's worked as a speaker, an author, consultant, and I'm fortunate to have him today as a podcast. He's written a couple books. One is called Formula X, How to Reach Extreme Acceleration in Your Organizations. And his newest book is Unblock, Clear the Way for Results and Develop a Thriving Organization. So we'll get to those. But first of all, welcome. I am so thrilled that you're with me today.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Ted.
And anything else you want to introduce yourself? Let the audience know about you. Anything else that I've not covered?
I think you've pretty much covered everything. I've been in this work for a long time, but I started out as an IT nerd. So I was all about computers and computer systems and software for a long time. After studying computer science as well, but I became increasingly interested in human problems rather than computer problems because they just seem more interesting, more complex to me.
Well, did you see a correlation?
I grew into it. In my career, I had several roles, and one of those roles became like project manager and chief technology officer. So I had to organize larger groups of IT people to create great outcomes. And that's how I got interested in the human side of IT and tech, and ultimately started to experiment with new ways of working outside of IT as well, that are more iterative and more focused on autonomy.
So is your expertise now in organizational behavior? I assume that's the right category. You consider yourself an expert in organizational behavior. Did that come from further education or just kind of what you learned by?
No, lots of experimentation. So started with in IT. You have a whole movement in the world of IT on agile software development, which is a way of creating software based on self-organizing teams. And I started applying that in my different roles. But over time, I discovered that highly autonomous self-organizing teams are great, but only if the rest of the system is able to support that. So over time, I bumped into all sorts of bureaucratic and hierarchical management structures. which then made me very curious of what I could do to repair those and basically get to the next level of performance. And so I shifted my work and I got several assignments in that space. And now I work across all sorts of functions and leadership teams.
That's awesome. I really am fascinated by, to this day, after working in organizations myself, is that bureaucracy is inevitable. I don't care what organization. It is the natural order of growth. If you are going to grow, you are going to become more bureaucratic. You cannot avoid it. So you're going to become that. The question then becomes, can you do it efficiently? And can you do it in such a way that it doesn't erect artificial barriers? Makes you sense. Well, if you're helping organizations and help them get better leadership, what's your personal leadership model or philosophy guiding style? What guides you as a leader?
Yeah, I think so. There's lots of different schools of thought, but definitely servant leadership is attractive and interesting, especially because it's on the other side of the pendulum of what you see often, where it's like the expectation of the leader is to that the leader should know it all, should be aware, should be giving orders, etc. Servant leadership flips that upside down. However, I think the sweet spot is somewhere in the middle. So it's a balancing act of understanding your role as a leader is to support and enable the team so they can do the work they need to do. But at the same time, the leaders have to set boundaries and create guardrails within that work can happen. And I've seen it swung like the pendulum swung too far towards the servant leadership a bit too much, where the teams are like, okay, but now tell me what to do. Like, I need some guidance. And the servant leadership like, no, what do you think we should do? Like that creates lots of confusion. So I think somewhere in the middle is good and healthy.
I couldn't agree with you more. I read an article one time where the author, trying to support the idea of servant leadership, claimed in the article that if you're really a servant leader, you're not worried about organizational goals. You're just worried about making sure the individuals, your people, are reaching their goals, but you're not worried about the organization. I almost wanted to tear the article apart. I was so furious, because nothing could be further from the truth. You got to be, you got to take care of people by providing them, as you said, a sense of direction. And so, how do you find that balance? I think you use that a couple times. How do you find the balance between caring for the organizational goals? And yet at the same time developing people? How do you balance? How do you recommend people balance that?
I think the concept that I've applied a lot and that I've also seen when I studied some of the fastest moving, most innovative companies out there is the principle of aligned autonomy. Servant leadership is often about giving teams and people space and autonomy to self-organize and just let them decide what to do. But the alignment part is as important, and you need both. So you need to create an environment where the teams are aware of the strategic context that they're operating in and what it means for their day-to-day work. And that's the job of the leader, to create the environment so both autonomy and alignment can thrive.
I couldn't agree with you more. I don't think those are opposites. I think they're two concepts that have to be blended. That's probably the art of leadership, is figuring out how to blend these things rather than trying to separate them. Oh, excellent. So tell us about your first book, Formula X, right?
Yeah.
What inspired it and what do you cover in the book?
Yeah, Formula X is a business fable or a leadership fable. Those things, though, those are often fun to read. Like I've read most of Patrick Lencioni's books, including 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, which was an example for us. And there's a few others out there. And actually, I was one of my co-authors. So my co-author was a famous Dutch management book author. And his publisher asked him about, what's your next book going to be? And should we just write a book about speed? And the world of Formula One seems interesting. So he went on to a journey to find content and people that are talking about that. And I actually was inspired by the world of Formula One motor racing a couple of years back because I was able to go behind the scenes of an F1 team and saw how they were able to create an environment of aligned autonomy with over 1,000 people. So I started blogging and speaking about that world, and then our paths met and we wrote a book together. So yeah, Formula X is a business fable where you follow a leader that has to radically accelerate their organization. And along the way, he gets inspiration from the world of F1 motorsport. And you can follow him through a transformational process to create shorter delivery times.
That's awesome. Now you heightened my interest in, as I mentioned before we came on, is I downloaded it on my Kindle. Now I have to raise it in my
Hmm.
order of read.
Yeah.
Thank you for doing that. But I love your idea of formula racing. Oftentimes I'm teaching the classes on teamwork. There's a
Hmm.
little video clip that is on YouTube, and it shows a Formula race car coming in for a pit stop.
Uh-huh.
And it comes in and it stops, and they change all four tires, refuel, and even give the driver something to drink. And in 2 seconds, he's gone.
Yeah.
And they slow it down, and you can see it. And I just find it fascinating. Total of 21 people so synchronized that
Yep.
they can pull off all of those tasks simultaneously and so quickly. So that
Yeah.
obviously contributes to it. So, wow. And so the antagonists of your book, what kind of roles do you give them? And
So in the book, this is a company where we're following the CEO, and there's also a founder who is a little bit at a distance from the CEO. But the founder has lots of influence and has lots of he's a bit, he's a bit loose. How would you say? Like, he's a bit uncontrollable. He starts an ad campaign without informing the CEO about the amazing speed of their kitchens. Like, he's really confronted with some really frustrating things, and he's doing his best to try to deliver the promises that are being made about his product on television. So that's part of the setup of the story, but I won't spoil everything. I think people should just go and read for themselves. Yeah, and I think the pit stops are just amazing as an example because there's extreme role clarity. Like, it's not that you car arrives and then you sit down and have a meeting and talk about, okay, so how should we approach this problem? No, there's, like, everybody knows their role. There's no discussion, and you have to be fully prepared and practiced. And every pit stop is analyzed to the millisecond. So every pit stop is filmed, including all of their practice stops that they do like 10 or 20 times per day. And every little movement is analyzed and then discussed and reviewed, which to me is a segue or like a metaphor for what I see leaders not do often in businesses. Formula One teams, they have a rhythm, a set of meetings, cadence, a meeting cadence that is already built in their way of working that really focuses on reflecting and improving. While in most ordinary businesses, we often, when something goes wrong, we might sit down and talk, but usually we just go on with our work because looking back feels like a waste of time, right? It doesn't feel like productive. Yeah.
I agree with you 100%. I don't know if you looked at my bio sketch, but I spent 22 years active duty in the U.S. Army. A wonderful way to spend an early life, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. But one of the neat things that I thought made the U.S. Army improve drastically coming out of the Vietnam history that we had. But anyway, transformational thing we did is something called the after action review. And of course, that's
Exactly.
spread business now. But I think that's exactly what you're talking about when you film things and then you sit down and you critique it. I think what happens is that you have to make accountability a positive thing. Often people think accountability and, oh my gosh, I'm going to be yelled at. I'm going to be held responsible for things I can't get done and so forth. And unfortunately, that does happen. There are leaders who don't know how to hold others accountable or be accountable themselves. Whereas accountability ought to have with it accountability to my boss means I get resources, I get aid, I get additional things I need to do to move forward, and I get praise too. So wow. That's a wonderful analogy. I think racing is just a great analogy to, I think, what happens that should be happening in businesses and in organizations. And so what's your second book, Unblock? What are the themes?
Yeah, so the subtitle of the book Unblock is Clear the Way for Results and Develop a Thriving Organization. So Unblock is all about helping leaders. It's a practical guide for leaders. It gives leaders a handbook of what they can do to overcome organizational obstacles. It all starts with having a clear goal in mind or a certain ambition that they need to achieve, which most leaders have. And then we go through 6 possible areas of the organization that can be blocked. Starting with strategy, crafting a strategy that actually creates alignment and focus at scale. Steering, everything around setting effective goals and finding the right things to measure. Accelerating decision-making and quality at every level. Ownership, developing a workplace where people happily take ownership and can do what is right for organization. Teamwork, so everything around psychological safety and mastering those practices of reflection, improvement, and feedback that we talked about. And finally, meetings, which is about replacing useless meetings with engaging rhythms of meetings that drive the work forward. So that's what the book roughly is.
Well, since you're a reader of Patrick Lencioni, did you overlap with his book, Death by Meeting?
Oh yeah, I reference it in my book. Yeah, it's definitely one of the sources of inspiration.
Excellent, excellent. Who are your other favorite authors that inspire you?
I think my journey on a more progressive and radical way of working started when I read Frederic Laloux's Reinventing Organizations. It's a book. There's a beautiful illustrated version that I recommend rather than the text version. But it has examples of companies that are working without management or without managers, without the traditional notion of a boss to boss hierarchy. One example is Morningstar, a tomato processing company in the US. And they're famous for colleagues sending each other's a colleague letter of understanding where they align among each other about what they can expect from each other for the next year, rather than these kinds of performance reviews happening through layers of management and HR. So there's a bunch of examples in there, and that's definitely a book to get some inspiration of what is also possible in a very different way.
So that's what you've written about in some of your inspirations, but how about your personal stories? Are there personal stories of examples where you've applied this stuff and had success?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I've helped a lot of leaders rethink their departments. So for example, one of the companies we work with is a big bank, and they were planning to introduce a lot of new structure because they were growing, and they were thinking along the more traditional lines of, should we add more layers of management? Because we have our direct span of control is growing too big. And the MBAs tell us that we should probably add more layers of management and kind of get ourselves into functional silos, which is what most companies do. And then we taught the leadership team practices and guardrails and processes to scale without needing those layers of management. We put a lot more autonomy into the teams. We created processes for resource allocation and planning that were more based on transparency and peer-to-peer. And we basically, for a big part, replaced the traditional jobs of managers that they had in mind, like the managers they were planning to hire, and put the work that they would be doing into processes that were manageable without needing additional people. So it's just one example where you could definitely grow without introducing a lot more management if you don't want to.
So it sounds like you found, at least in that one example, a process was a solution to better performance.
Yeah, it's a process, but a process is what's visible above the surface, which is a set of agreements about how things should work in the organization. Ultimately, it's a cultural and behavior shift of both the teams and the leaders that are involved, so that teams take ownership when they want to and are able to, and leaders let go a little bit more and trust the teams to do. Yeah.
As you're doing that, and you mentioned the word culture, as they come to the agreements and about process, and I think that's kind of a subset of, do they come to an agreement on an overarching culture? Is there overarching culture, and then you have a series of processes that people get things done? But is there clarity about what that unifying culture is?
I think the way you can describe or express a culture is through articulating principles. So you could, depends on where you're on the journey. But in this case, they sat down and said, you know what, we want to introduce a couple of principles that allows us to guide our day-to-day behavior. And then after that, culture change follows. It's not that the principles immediately change the culture, of course. It will take time for people to understand them, to work with them, and to experiment with them. But yeah.
How many clients have you had where they expected overnight success? Tell us that one thing we got to do differently. We're going to do it, and wow, we're going to take off. And of course, nothing could be farther from the truth.
Like I've had that, although I've also been flown in when they tried something and they thought it would work after day one, and then after half a year, like it completely blew up. And then me and my team came in to kind of repair it. It's a mindset thing as well, like the silver bullet mindset. I see it a lot also if I touch back into that, what I said about the agile software development world. Like when it comes to frameworks, and agile frameworks are no different. People think, well, if we just implement that framework, all of our problems will be solved. Well, in fact, those frameworks should allow you to kind of, apply it to your environment, and some of those things might not work because those frameworks were developed and were successful for one organization. Doesn't mean that it will work in your organization. And that's, I think, part of the snake oil that some consultants are selling is just do this. And here's the cases that it should work for you. And I'm always very careful with that. And that's why also in my Unblock book, although I touch on these 6 elements that I described, all of it is optional. And all of it is like, you have to figure out, of all of the options I'm giving you, which of the options you want to try.
Absolutely.
And you're going to experiment with and expect some things to not work for you.
And I think that's where you really need to have a visionary leader or somebody who can realize we're on a journey and it's going to take us a while to really see the magnificent outcomes that organizational change can bring about.
Well, it requires some self-awareness as well. I have worked with clients where it's like, we have to fix this system, this problem, this team configuration. But in the end, it kept coming back to that leader and the way the leader was showing up, and the fact that the leader was not showing the behavior that was in line with the new principles of the culture they set out. Yeah, it's sometimes hard to have a tough conversation with your client as a consultant and say, you know what, you have to be open and you have to start changing your behavior. Otherwise, there's no point in employing me here. So that happens sometimes, but more often than not, it's a leader that is actually well aware of their own behavior and how they affect the system.
You bring up an interesting point, and I couldn't agree with you more. It starts with leadership. But then a couple minutes ago, you talked about the fact that you organized, helped somebody organize, and they got away from a management structure that they were thinking they needed.
Yeah.
Do you see there's a difference then between having leaders versus managers?
I think it's a definition thing. I think the work of management still exists even if you work without managers. Mm-hmm. And like I said, even companies like Tesla are innovating in that space. I recently heard that Tesla has basically automated middle management. When you arrive at one of those factories, you walk to a certain workstation, which is a certain area, and the computer will calculate for you what is the ROI of the problem that this group of people is working on. And we'll tell you, like, how does this problem set rank to some of the other problem sets that other people are working on. And if you're not working on on a valuable problem, you should just abandon that workspace and find something else to do, right? This is typically what a management would usually do, where it's like, oh, we have to start this project. We're going to allocate these people on this project, and then we're going to decide when this project starts and stops. You could indeed, with processes and automation, get rid of that. But the work itself of figuring out what is the problem to solve, how do we put the right money and people against the problem, what is the priority, what is the strategy, that work still needs to happen. And then when it comes to leaders and leadership, I think you also probably heard this many times, but everybody could be a leader, irrespective of their positional authority. Right? If you're able to let people follow you, then you are a leader by definition. That could mean that some people in the C-suite are not leaders because they're not being followed by anyone. And it could also mean that some people on the shop floor are leaders because they are highly influential. So yeah, it's a definition thing, I think.
Well, I think I couldn't agree more definition, but I think it's also a behavior thing in the sense that I think a leader will emerge. And I think I really like to distinguish between those. Years and years ago, I first got started in the consulting business. I did leadership seminars, workshops for American Management Association, 5 cities, 5 days, and so forth. And I used to start off by, is there a difference between being a manager and a leader? And people consistently said, a leader touches me, a manager controls me. That was right. The distinction between that. And so I think the leaders are good, even in that less hierarchical organization. I'll use that word to describe what you were talking about. There will be people who emerge. Yeah. Like John Maxwell said, talking about leadership as one word only, influence. A bit simplistic, but he does have a good point. So somebody is going to emerge as an influencer. Yeah, I think they can change. They can change from problem to problem. group to groups and so forth. So, well, it sounds
And
like you do some. Please go ahead.
I want to say like that. What to build on that? The nice thing about getting rid of some of the hierarchical management structures that we sometimes have is that it allows leaders to grow or to emerge. Like you said, sometimes you discover people that were just hidden away in the corner of the organization. They were just following orders. But if they're able to spread their wings, they do fly. And you basically create the environment where the talent in your organization can get to its full potential. While if you stick to some of the more traditional management systems, it might be held back and held down.
I couldn't agree with you more. I love again, going back to Maxwell, is one of his books. I think it's the 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership. One of them was the Law of the Lid. And if we put a lid on people, you're going to cap them.
Yep.
You let them fly, as you say. One, they got to sort their way out. They're going to make mistakes. And how do you then guide them into the right course? So that's another whole field, is leadership development, which is a fascinating field, and that's why I love it so much. So as we wrap up, because I want to respect your time, as I always ask my guests, what are the 3 practical things you would recommend people do as a result of listening to us today?
Yeah. So the first thing is, connecting back to what we said earlier, is develop habits for reflection, and make it the norm that you occasionally, on a rhythm, sit down to reflect about how things are going, what is working well, what could be better, and make it the norm. So it's just something we do. It's not something we have to, it's not the exception, right? It's not like, we only do this when, no, just put it on the schedule and sit down and talk. And there's multiple ways to make it a fun and interesting exercise. It always leads to improvement and getting stronger as a team. Number 2 is letting people choose what they want to contribute. Management often gets into the space of directing, who's going to work on what. And there's very little room for people to have a say in that. And I think if you want to, so in the back, if you're watching the video, I have a sign which is, I try to be innovative once, but I get stuck in meetings. What you often see is, like, if there is a great idea, if you are working somewhere and you want to affect change because you see an opportunity or you see an obstacle that could be removed if we do something, it's often very hard to get it done if you're not in the positional power, you don't have the authority. So letting people choose what to contribute, I think, is a principle that if you design your environment and your organizational system around that idea, is that you make it easy for people to get funding or to get a short experiment, or for people to pick which projects they want to do and which projects they want to move away from. And that's a super helpful way to create more innovation and more engagement and ownership in the company. Number 3, last one, is all about accelerating decision making. And so often when we are making decisions, we treat every decision as if it's the same type of decision. But by distinguishing reversible and irreversible decisions from each other, we are able to accelerate. Because if something is reversible, we should just go and do it. And then if by doing it, we discover if it was the right choice or not, and then we can course correct, rather than spending more time in meetings, in reviews, and trying to get more data and analysis to figure out, is it the right thing to do? And the magic phrase that we often teach our clients is the question of, is it safe to try? So when you're sitting down trying to make a decision, instead of asking, or do we all agree, is this the right decision? You ask, is it safe to try? And that it really shifts the conversation into trying things more, doing more action, and learning along the way.
Well, those are marvelous. I like those. So let me summarize them real quick. Number 1 was develop habits of reflection, wonderful thing to do. 2, let people choose what they want to contribute rather than how, but the what. And number 3, delegate or develop an irreversible decisions. I love that. And your phrase, is it safe to try? That is an excellent summary. Well, I deeply appreciate your time this morning. My morning, your afternoon.
Yeah.
Taking it. And I hope that sometime in the future I can have you back and we can go further into particularly the ideas of unblock. I'd love to hear, and I think my listening audience would love to hear more about those topics. So thank you so much. Any closing thought?
Well, thank you, Ted. This was a great chat indeed. If people want to learn more about the new book, they can go to www.unblockbook.net. or just type in unblock book in Amazon and you'll find it.
Absolutely. Good. Well, I've downloaded it. I encourage others to do it as well.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, my friend. Now we've got 3 ideas of what to share from today's podcast. So again, what I'd like for you to be able to do is take those ideas, make them your own, reflect on them. What do they mean to you? And then thirdly, commit to an action plan. Commit to actions that you can take to apply what we've talked about today. If you want help, if you want some ideas, if you want some accountability, please contact me. Contact me by sending me a text, 913-306-1499. Put podcast follow-up in the text message, and I'll get back to you within 24 hours. Thank you so much for listening today, and I'll see you on our next broadcast.